Have you ever heard the sound of freedom?
Welcome to another 5-minute flip.
What is up, Flip-Eponymai? Welcome to your 5-minute flip for May 15th, 2024. So today I am going to be referencing some stuff I started talking about in episode 91, long-form episode. It was on December 13th, 2023, called Control and Hope Beyond Our Circumstances. So I'd recommend maybe going back and listening to that if any of this stuff connects with you. And this is going to be a little raw today, so it might be a little too fresh to be sharing, but I wanted to share it because I know a lot of people connected with that episode 91, and I was sharing about some issues of depression that I've been dealing with for a long time, and within those issues is a sense of stuckness, and often, when you feel stuck in a situation, depression becomes an inevitable sort of response from your body because there's nowhere to go, and so then it just kind of goes inward, and boom, the depression hits. And so some pretty big breakthroughs, that I shared in episode 91, and then stuff came back. I would say this, it's hope beyond our circumstances, but when your circumstance doesn't change, you can then get triggered. And for those of you that struggle with depression, and triggers certainly is a word we use in addiction conversations as well, and there's some overlap here. But you know that whether it's depression or anxiety, you can get triggered by things, and then your brain has its auto response to that stimulus. And if you're on your game and you have your tools sort of ready, you can filter it out in a healthy way or combat that trigger, and or your brain can just slip back into this state of, depression or anxiety or whatever it may be. And so, yeah, in a podcast setting like this, I'm not going to get into all the specifics of what my areas of stuckness have been, but let's leave it general sort of on purpose. So you can insert fill in the blank, for your life. I often think that with Paul when he talks about the thorn in his flesh in 1 Corinthians, where he doesn't say what the thorn is. And I kind of like that because we can fill in the blank of our own thorn, that Jesus' grace is sufficient for us in our weakness. But back, it probably would have been around December when I recorded that other podcast, which now is, 6 months ago. I found this article, and I shared some of that article in that episode. It's on a type of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy. I'll warn you now, this is not going to be a 5-minute flip. I know they never are. I'll try to keep it as brief as I can. But acceptance and commitment therapy, and I found an article, and I've been reading kind of highlights of that article ever since to kind of keep myself healthy, and it's just been a really helpful way of processing. And recently kind of fell back over the cliff, as I call it, or there's a line, where the depression just kind of comes over you, and it's like, man, I do not want this. I'm not choosing to have this. Asking all kinds of people to be praying for me, and because it's just there's so much stuff that's connected, right, in your life when that sort of thing starts taking over. And so I thought about this article, and I went back and reread it, and the article itself, it didn't hit in the same way, when it's familiar, it's a familiar topic. So, but as I'm thinking about it, I'm like, acceptance and commitment therapy, I mean, that's a thing, and this person who wrote this article didn't create it. And so I put that into my podcast app, and I found 5 or 6 podcasts about acceptance and commitment therapy. And I listened to the first one, and it was an interview with the person that created acceptance and commitment therapy and has been doing it now for 40 years or so. So I'm listening to this interview, and as I'm listening, they're talking about a book that this individual wrote, and I went, man, I'm just going to read that book, or specifically, I'm going to listen to that book because that's where I'm at right now. So listening to the audiobook of this book, and the book, actually, I think the title is a little bit corny, and maybe even, I think, it just doesn't clearly communicate what the really good content of the book. But just to give you a heads up, the book is called A Liberated Mind: How to Pivot Towards What Matters, and the author is Stephen C. Hayes, PhD, who is the originator of acceptance and commitment therapy. So why am I sharing this on my podcast? It's because we talk a lot about depression on here. We talk a lot about mental illness. And this has been really helpful for me, and I hope it's helpful for you. And really, I've been experiencing a lot of change and a lot of hope just in these recent days. And it's things certainly I hope last. I feel like there's some dots connecting that are things I've been dealing with for years and years and years. And there's really a really simple one. There's multiple takeaways, but one of the really simple takeaways is something you hear a lot. You hear a lot in church. You hear a lot in whatever space you may be in any kind of, I think, mental health space or whatever. And it's about living in the present. And I want to talk about that a little bit. This little 5-minute flip will not nearly do justice to kind of the whole breadth of this kind of this therapy. And I'm only about a third of the way through the book, so I don't endorse everything in it. But man, there's been some things for me and the way I'm wired that have been really helpful. If you do read the book, I would suggest skipping chapter 3. It's just a lot of critique of other therapies that I was like, this is wasting my time. So there you go. If you read it, I'd skip chapter 3. But this idea of living in the present, that's one of them. And I think that's something that's very relevant to all of us. And then the piece that really hit, and I'll come back to that, the piece that really stuck with me that relates to me, I'm a big-time feeler. So I'm an ENFP on the Myers-Briggs. If you know the Myers-Briggs, the F stands for feeler or feeling or something like that. I score very high on that one. In the Enneagram, I'm an 8, which is in the gut quadrant, and I've always felt that way. I lead from my gut. I have big emotions. I'm a big feeler. And man, I've never put this connection together where my feelings, my thoughts and my feelings with this depression, these areas where I'm stuck, these circumstances where I'm stuck, my thoughts and feelings really drive the car. And so they come about and they are so strong, it's nothing that I can control. It's just, that's how I feel. And some of it is conviction-based. Some of it is whatever it may be. It's how I feel, and it feels like these feelings are so strong that they just sort of take over. They take over my experience of reality. And what they call it ACT, A-C-T, ACT therapy. So I'll just call it ACT for the rest of this little 5-minute flip. What ACT does is it helps you, they call it the dictator within. And again, I'm just going to tell you what's been helping me, and I hope it helps some of you. It's not going to help everybody. But this dictator within, the author, he talks a lot about his own anxiety issue, and that's kind of what this came out of, where this anxiety was this voice, that's in his head. And we're not talking about like schizophrenic voices. We're talking about the thing that's coming up with these thoughts and the thing that's coming up with these feelings. We all have that. These thoughts that we don't generate, they just are there. And he calls that the dictator within. And he looked at the dictator within and he said, I don't know who you are, where these thoughts are coming from, but you don't get to dictate my experience of the present moment of reality. And what I really relate to is how the dictator within, because it's based on these certain rules that we have decided we're going to follow and abide by. And these are unshakable rules. And this is not a diss at all to anyone who struggles with these things, but he used the examples of patients who struggle with paranoia or obsessive compulsive disorder, where there's these rules that they're, dictator within, using the language of the book, of ACT, the dictator within them has determined these rules that they're going to abide by, whether it's OCD or paranoia. He gave an example of someone who thought, the government was out to get them and there was all these secret agents around them. And so if you told them otherwise, they're so fixated on the rule inside of them that this is true. They're not going to listen to you. They have this, I think he calls it a conceptualized sense of self, this concept within them that's so strong. They would just say, well, you're part of the government conspiracy against me, right? That's that kind of idea. And I'm starting to pick up on this and how it relates to my life. I've got these rules, and I'm going to follow these rules, and that's where these thoughts and feelings are coming from. But to get to the point, he's like, look, what I learned is we can separate ourselves from those thoughts and feelings. And I think I've always just thought, well, my thoughts and feelings are mine. They are Noah, and so they're here, and they tell me what Noah needs or Noah wants, or whatever that may be, and so that dictates my reality. And what ends up happening is you spend all this time ruminating. Ruminating is about the past, about how you got to the point you're in, and you live in the past, and you think about wanting to do some things differently. And then you also spend a lot of time in fantasy. That's the word I use for it. These alternate realities going forward, these alternate futures, these potential futures, and your brain is, again, it's stuck. So what is it doing? It's looking for solutions, and it's going to create these solutions because its current reality doesn't have any solutions or any options. So then you end up living in these two spaces, the future and the past, neither one of which is the present. And the present is all we have. If you think about life, the present is all that we have. And he says, the dictator within, these thoughts and feelings, when we fixate on this conceptualized sense of self inside of us, it creates alienation, because think of, again, back to the person with paranoia or with OCD, they're so obsessed is the word used. They're so obsessed with this rule that they're going to follow. It's creating alienation with people that have a healthier perspective on reality. And so that's a whole other kind of piece of the therapy is other people's perspectives and basing your some of your concepts on that. But where it's really helped me is to go, okay, reality is all I have. And it's interesting because I write about some of this in Beyond the Battle. The last couple chapters are about fantasy versus reality. And so it's just fascinating how I've written some of these very words myself, and yet in a way, these are some of my deepest struggles, not where I've went off and had affairs, which is kind of what I'm talking about in the book, or pornography or affairs are ways, are outlets that we go to in fantasy, or just fantasizing thoughts, right? Because we're not content with our reality. But to understand some of the psychology behind it, just some of the dots have really been connecting for me recently, where we don't have, when we commit to living in the present moment, which is, again, a Beyond the Battle principle of gratitude for the mercies God has given us and the gifts that he's given us every day. So there's a lot of overlap here too with the recovery world and these conversations we have about porn recovery and sexual sin kind of recovery, which I think affects so many people. If you're wanting to be with someone that isn't your spouse, if you're wishing you were single, if you're married and you wish you were single, if you're single and you wish you were married, which I think is just affects massive percentages of our population, then all this stuff applies to you, where we create these fantasy scenarios. I talk about it like the grass is greener where you water it. That's a quote. I can't remember who it's from. And so invest in the grass you have, right? So now we're just talking Beyond the Battle stuff. Invest in the grass that you've been given. And so I'm back at that point where I'm going, man, this is so interesting that it's these thoughts and feelings that are really strong in me that I'm letting drive the car. It's this dictator within that I'm letting drive the car, which is getting me to this stuck feeling, to the depression, and it's creating alienation in my life with these other, relationships, which leads to more depression. Where if you can live in the present and you go, the present is all I have. What can I do to maximize the present? What can I do? And the therapy talks about your values as well. And so I can actually let my values of create my agency. See, when you're depressed, you don't feel like you have any agency. When you're stuck, you feel like you don't have any agency. You don't get to make your own choices. But when you go, the present is all I have. You listening to this podcast, whatever you're doing right now, driving your car, doing the dishes, whatever it is, this is your present moment. It is the only reality that exists. And the deception is you can ruminate on the past, or you can create these potential futures. And all that does is takes away from your current reality. It withers the grass under your feet. So when you look down at your feet, the grass is brown and dried up, and you get even more sad. If we can look at the present, and I love the word present, it's a dual meaning. A present like a Christmas present or a birthday present. The present is a present. And if you can see it that way and say, this is reality, this is my reality, not the rumination of the past, not the alternate future, if you want to overlap into the recovery world beyond the battle world, not the porn you're tempted to look at, not this other man or woman that you would want to be with. And that's another piece. Our culture says, follow your feelings. Well, your body's naturally going to have feelings. It's going to have feelings for other men. It's going to have feelings for other women. And I love what this therapy is helping me with. It's separating myself from those feelings to go, those feelings don't have to drive the car. I can look at those feelings as coming from the dictator and just go, okay, they're there. You observe them. You don't suppress them. You observe them. When they're useful, your thoughts and feelings, you apply them to your reality, your present moment, but you separate yourself from them, where you take their power away. They don't get to dictate your present reality. You do, and your values do. And it's just been really life-giving for me, and I'll wrap up with this. It's been really life-giving for me and a lot of this one of the practices is mindfulness, if you're familiar with that practice. But this mindfulness of the moment, where you go, this is the moment I have, and it's a tactile moment. And if I'm with one of my daughters, or I'm with my wife, or I'm with this stuck situation that I'm in, it may not be the reality that I want, like this alternate reality that my feelings tell me I need to have. But it is the only reality I have, and this reality is a gift. It is the present, and I do get a choice and have agency in maximizing this current reality that I'm in. And when I can do that, there's a humbling effect. I have to humble myself to give up some of those conceptualized senses of self, to give up some of those other, kind of wishful realities. But when I'm able to do that, when you're able to do that, wow, I think I'm starting to experience some really significant levels of peace. And I think in all this, we can ground this as believers in the gospel. We can ground it in the mercy we've been given in Jesus and say, this is part of the present. The part of the present is the love of Jesus. And part of the present is listening to this podcast, and it's drinking this coffee, and it's this person that I'm in a conversation with, and understanding their perspective rather than being so fixated on my internalized concepts that are getting me so stuck, to start with. So I hope that connects with some of you. If that scratches an itch, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to episode 91. As I mentioned, the book that I'm referring to is called A Liberated Mind. Hold on one second. All right, I'm back. Sorry about that. It's A Liberated Mind by Stephen C. Hayes. And it's ACT, Acceptance and Commitment Therapy. It's something I'm talking to my therapist about. Like, hey, I want to do more of this. I want to get stronger in this. And perhaps you'll hear more from me as time goes on, as I practice these things and apply them. They're great in and of themselves, and I think they also can lead us into a greater sense of gratitude for what we already have in Jesus, and getting to experience that in the present moment rather than always being lost in the future or the past, where we don't get to experience the contentment of what we already have in Jesus. So thanks for listening. This wraps up this edition of the 5-Minute Flip. I will see you next time on the flip side.
Thanks for listening to this 5-Minute Flip. Subscribe for more flips and long-form episodes of The Flip Side. Visit www.patreon.com/NoahFilippiak to support and get sweet Flipside swag.